one new person from my office who I believe, let me see if she's signed on. Her name is Anastasia Dickerson. Yes, she is signed on.
Yes, I'm
Um,
here. Hi,
oh,
Vickie.
hi. I don't know if you heard the good news. It's being recorded, so if you have to pop out for some reason, don't worry about it, okay?
Okay, cool beans.
Okay. All right. It says, by attending this, I'm consenting to be included. Okay.
Thank you for consenting to be included in this.
Of course, I
Uh,
consent. I consent.
but Vickie,
Uh,
want to thank you though for, providing the opportunity to hear from you. You know public housing backwards, forwards, and sideways, as well as the RAT program. So we really
yeah.
thought it's a useful time in the program to hear one, right? What program are we converting from, right?
Yeah.
We know we carry over some of those like core tenets of the public housing program and
Mhm.
of the PRAC program and ownership and control. Let's reaffirm those. And
Yeah.
man, we would just love to hear the lessons learned that you've learned
Yeah.
along the way
We'll
that we've
we'll
all learned
link to them.
together.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think I learn something every day. And when you told me to put some down, I'm like, oh my gosh, where do I start? You know,
right. Where'd you stop?
it's always a learning experience. So, but it's always good. It's always good to have a group here and to talk and so the things that John provided to you from me, um, um, I'll keep the PowerPoint up on the screen. But the other things that I gave out for John to give to you, one was it's a law review article I wrote last year. I had spoke before the ABA, I think it was like the fall session. And so the beginning of this year, they asked me if I would write an article for the journal that they published, the Affordable Housing of the ABA, and I did. And I thought that was helpful to give to your group, John, because it has all this rich history, but it also has all the other things that you can do to sort of try to keep this housing alive. You know, whether it's RAD or some other way, it talks about the ways. And so I thought it was just a helpful thing to share. You know, it's 20 pages, but it'll go fast because half of it's footnotes. So, but the footnotes are rich in information. And so if you really want to dig in, it's all there. And then the other thing I gave you is a set of training notes that I've used before. And so I'll be referring to those during this presentation. Then I've given you the ownership and control for both component one and also for the 202 RAD-PRAC. So, and the ownership and control on just component one is already on your resource desk, but this is pumped up. So you got a fresh new version, and I'll ask Leanne to transfer that because I think that'll be helpful. I mean, there's a whole lot of similarities, of course, between ownership and control with what we do in component one and what we do with 202 RAD-PRAC, but there's a few little things. So I wanted to bring those out. And as John said at the end, I'm going to tell you the lessons I've learned. And as we go along, put your hand up if you want me to stop to, answer a question. I'm ready, and I might need a breath just to get something to drink in between all this chit chat. But the thing I want to do as we go along, and here, let me just go to the next slide. Um, you got the journal, you got the handout. I'm going to go over the key points. But what I want to do along this little training is, why does any of this matter for you and for RAD? It's all lovely to know about public housing. You guys don't work in public housing, but some of this really matters to you. And it can cause you heartburn and issues if you don't know a little bit more. And I'm going to tell you why you need to know just that little bit more. Okay? So, you ready to go? All right, let's go. So, what is public housing? Ooh, that's a real basic question. And I always start my talks out with a quote. And I like this quote by Rachel Raymond. It's sort of like what I see is what's so wonderful about this thing called public housing. Helping, fixing, and serving represent three different ways of seeing life. When you help, you see life as weak. When you fix, you see life is broken. But when you serve, you see life as a whole. Fixing and helping may be work of the ego, but service is the work of the soul. And I think that's so true of public housing and what you're doing in RAD to keep that going. So it's been going, by the way, since 1933. Started out with the National Industrial Recovery Act. Formerly, we had this Federal Emergency Administration of Public Works, and they were developing, owning, and operating public housing throughout the country. And it became a little controversial because it was getting this property through eminent domain. And we all know how controversial eminent domain can be. And so Congress decided to fix this with the United States Housing Act of 1937. So you often hear me talk about different sections of the 37 Act. And so it dealt with those constitutional problems and authorized the development funding for low rent housing by state and locals. And to do this, they were able to establish a new entity, an independent legal entity known as a PHA. The PHA to serve as the developer, owner, and manager of this low rent housing. And in order to keep it going, the federal government, would enter into a contract. Back then, it was a contract, the annual contributions contract. That's how we got the name. Today, it is not a contract. You need to know that. It is a grant, and the grant is established by way of the funds that are given in the public housing program, the operating funds and the capital funds grants. So how did these state and local governments serve this housing? Well, they entered into a cooperation agreement, which basically said that the PHA, for basic services such as police and fire, for the low rent housing, they would accept a payment in lieu of taxes instead of property taxes. So you often have that as a question in RAD. And it makes a difference on how much it's going to cost to operate this. If you're getting pilot because you qualify as being this type of entity that is sort of exempt from property taxes or not. In mixed finance, we have the authority in the 37 Act to pay taxes, but for the most part, no public housing is paying property taxes. They're all paying pilot. And this pilot basically comes from the department in the form of operating subsidy to the housing authority, and then is to go out to the locality. If the housing authority doesn't give it to the locality, the housing authority can't keep it. They have been. The new operating fund notice that's coming out is going to say, if you don't give it to the locality, and even if the locality gives it back to you, you got to give it back to HUD. So that's new. So anyway, so we have this cooperation agreement, and right now we have about 1 million units of public housing, and we have about 3,300 or so PHAs that are operating this. Initially, when this was being developed, there were bonds that were being held to help finance this. Today, any development is being not done through government bonds. It's being done through these different programs we've had, like when we had Hope 6. Now we have capital fund to a very limited extent to do development, or mixed finance when we mix in other money to do the development of not only public housing, but other affordable housing. So I was telling you, so how do we pay for this? We pay for it with operating funds. We've been doing that since 1969. We were able to get modernization money also in about the 70s, late 60s, because this housing starts to deteriorate, and operating money is not enough when mixed with rents. So all the mod programs, they've come under different names. There was CAP, there was Comp Grant, and now there's Capital Fund. In the appropriations today, even though there are separate amounts, basically Congress is trying to get us all into one big fund. Even though they sort of say, well, this amount is going out by formula for UP, and this amount is going out by formula for CAP. And those formulas are in the regs, in the 990 for op fund and in the 905 for cap funds. And the formula factors are in the statute. But somehow when they look at it, how much money they're going to give to HUD for public housing, they're sort of lumping it together, but then still pulling it apart. I don't know how much sense that makes, but they're still thinking about a block grant approach. What will that mean for RAD? I think it makes it a little easier if we get it that way, because it's one lump rather than, having to parcel here and parcel there. But, the thing to remember is while it's public housing, it has to follow public housing rules. It has to follow the regs, has to follow 37 Act, has to follow the ACC, has to be under a cooperation agreement. And that's what you have to live with and make sure we follow until we get to a closing. Couple exceptions. If we decided we were going to do early start or something like that to give them the early advantage while it's still public housing, or to do early demolition, not under 18, but under RAD, even then, even though you're giving that permission, what you're doing there is still ultimately under public housing. So just want you to keep that in mind. So we have these ACCs. I told you about the cooperation agreements. As far as, and I should tell you one more thing about these ACCs. There are different amendments to the ACC. So you may have heard about those. There's the cap fund financing ACC amendment. If we were doing funding, let's say through bonds, not government, not our bonds, but maybe some local bonds or other kinds of financing. It's sort of not a guarantee, not full faith and credit, but it's a way to bring more money in to do capital fund modernization or development of units. And it's paid for, sort of annually or however quarterly they want to structure it, but it's paid off the top of that PHA's cap fund. The cap fund office reviews these applications. Haven't been many lately. I mean, this was the big thing, 10 years ago. We did so much of this, but you can only use up to 30% of your annual money to pay your debt service on this capital fund financing. And that and the big ones, they all did it. But then you hit the wall when you get up to 30%. Op fund financing, the same thing. No rules on that. This is kind of a case by case, and it's money coming out of the reserves to pay this. A little niche. Not too many do this, but it's the same concept. And again, but you can only use it for units. You can't go and do your administrative building or something like that. Then we have energy performance contract ACC amendments. And you know what the energy performance contracts are when you're getting into these RAD deals. You have to figure out if you're pulling out units to become Section 8, what's happening with the energy financing that's sitting on that AMP or however large the group is. So you have to be sure there's enough money to keep paying that, and most of that, is supposedly being paid for with the savings that these units are generating by using these energy improvements. Sometimes not, but anyway, so there is this ACC amendment because we often put what's called a Section 30. It's another kind of restriction because you can't go out and put something ahead of the DOT. The DOT, again, is these restrictive covenants, just like the RAD use agreement. They're very similar, just different programs. But it has to be primary. No lien is supposed to get above it. Everything's below it because we're trying to preserve this housing for a period of time. The statute sets a period of time. 20 years for mod related use, 40 years for development related use of funds. So it sits out there. These EPC though, that get this Section 30, same thing. That EPC financing, Section 30 financing has to be below the DOT. But we have to confirm that there is really a DOT out there. And that's the fun part. I mean, that's another thing. Why do these DOTs matter? Well, they matter because they do have sort of an institutional memory of what is the property? How many units were there? Where was this stuff? And they're not often all that good. The older they get, the worse they get. And some of them are so old, they are like the original DOTs that were put on there whenever the government bonds were first issued. And those were not for the benefit of HUD and were not for the benefit of the residents. It was for the benefit of the bondholders. And so those old ones, if you ever see one of these old DOTs, it basically says when the bonds are paid, this thing goes poof. Well, they didn't. Every time we get a title with one of these on, and if we're not going to close right away, I'll say, hey, you really need to bring this up because that one's technically gone. But even the title companies, they'll say to us, well, we want to make sure it's really gone, so let's make a release happen for this old DOT. So we say, okay. The other kind of mixed finance ACC amendment is for mixed finance transactions. So it sort of goes into and adds a whole series of changes to the ACC for the mixed finance. So, that's that's important. And then we have enforcement related ACC amendments. So the housing authority, defaults, we end up conditioning their money. And we do that usually by conditioning grants. And it's usually the easiest one to condition is the CAP grant. And so we do that. We do it for fair housing reasons or other reasons. There's also resident management corporation amendments. Now, that used to be the thing where we had these resident organizations managing public housing. I think there's less than a handful of those anymore, but those were amendments. So let's see here. And I think I could change the slide. Let's go to the next page. Okay, so I already started talking to you about how it was funded, CAP and OP. Here's the citations for it. I've told you it's by formula, what the eligible uses are of it. Basically, the only real difference between CAP and OP, other than some of the technical uses, is how it's administered. It's the operating fund, you fill out these forms. CAP fund, you do plans. You do an annual plan, 5-year plan, which are very similar to the broader annual plans and 5-year plans in public housing. Those broader ones, the annual plan, 5-year plans, they matter to you, by the way. They have to have a plan. It mentions RAD. They have to have a plan if they're doing demolition. This plan has to be approved by HUD. If HUD gets the plan and doesn't do anything with it in 90 days, it's approved. But they can't get funding if they don't have a plan and if they don't certify that they're complying with the plan. So anyway, that's basically 903 of the 37 Act. And in that handout that I gave to you, I have all of the basic certifications that comes along with that, civil rights, the state and local certification. So you have all of that good stuff. So we've talked about plans. I think you understand when I say development, I mean the creation of public housing. Don't use that term development to mean the project. The project is the building. So I see that confusion a lot, and it leads to other problems down the road. We've talked about operations. These are all primarily by the PHA. We've talked a little bit about the fact that it's a grant. The fact that this funding is a grant makes the OMB grant requirements, especially the procurement requirements applicable to anytime you use public housing grant money, the OP or the CAP. You're supposed to follow 2 CFR Part 200. We have a handbook in public housing. It hasn't been updated. It still refers to the old Part 85, unfortunately. But that's what a housing authority has to use. You know, there's different methods. There's small purchase up to $250,000 per contract. You just go out and make 3 phone calls and decide what's reasonable. But if it's over 250, you're going to have to do a competitive, like an RFP. If it's anything other than A&E work, A&E can do an RFQ. A little bit difference in how much paperwork is involved. But if it's an emergency, for example, then there's reasons to do non-competitive, and the regs allow for that. So all this money, here's another thing, why it matters to you, this procurement stuff. Any money being used while you're getting ready to close, that's CAP fund money. They're going out, buying things, fixing things. It's all subject to public housing requirements. It's all subject to those procurement requirements. They can be doing some pre-development work, right? That's going to benefit the RAD project. But all that work has to be in accordance with the public housing requirements for procurement. So it's kind of a sticky point, but that's the way it goes. Okay. So because you're following this grant methodology, you're going to follow it for your auditing, reporting, your financial management, your cash management. And, you know, luckily, you know, we still have Alan Kaufman on staff. He understands all about financial management and these BLIs and where money goes from this account to that account, all very important. You know, we're keeping all of our ducks in a row. So we can say, yes, when we used it for an eligible public housing purpose, and when we're using it for an eligible Section 8 purpose. At that closing, that's like the magical, like the wand goes and says, what was once public housing has now become Section 8. But you can't go the opposite way. Once it's become Section 8, you can't wave the wand and make it go back, you know? So once the genie leaves the bottle of public housing, it's there for the RAD purposes, whether it's going into immediate rehabilitation or it's gone into a reserve. It's going in a Section 8 and staying a Section 8. So that's an important point. Another important point of financial management are these general depository agreements, the HUD 51999. You often see, like, whenever there are proceeds, like, you know, they're selling something and we're saying put those proceeds in a GDA for affordable housing purposes. Why is that GDA so important? Well, mainly it's important in public housing, especially for the OP fund program, because housing authorities are allowed to draw down 1/12 of their money each year and each month. So, you know, so that money is leaving Treasury. How is it protected? Well, that GDA says you're putting it into an insured account. And if it goes over the FDIC insured amount, then it has to be fully and continuously collateralized with basically Treasury approved financial instruments. CAP doesn't work that way. CAP, you have an obligation, you have an expenditure, then you draw down from Treasury. So there's, you know, there might be a day or two gap, but you don't have money hanging out outside of Treasury, unprotected, unsecured. And so that's why that's important. It's important whether this money is sitting outside as we're operating public housing, or it's important in Section 8. Section 8 has the requirement for the GDA in the regulations. In public housing, the GDA requirement is in the ACC and in various notices. It's in this PIH notice 96-33. So, so that's the importance of the financial management. Demo, conversion, demolition. I think you're kind of familiar with. If we're going to do it pursuant to public housing, we're going to follow Section 18 and Part 970. If we're going to do like a streamlined voluntary conversion, we're going to do it under 972 and Section 33 of the 37 Act. But if we're going to do a RAD conversion, we do it in accordance with the RAD notice and the RAD statute. Okay. Let's go to another slide here. So, special things. I mean, I've already told you about some special things, but one special thing is the Move to Work program, and it has really grown since 1996. It really allows the PHAs the opportunity to design and test and do some things to allow exemptions for existing public housing and voucher programs, and allows you to combine your OP, your CAP, and your Section 8 tenant-based assistance into one funding source. And that's very, very attractive. And we worked with MTW agencies in the RAD program, and we just have to make sure that their MTW plan incorporates this RAD work, just the way we care about the annual plan and the 5-year plan just for regular public housing being converted through RAD. In the handout, I gave you what the standard MTW agreement looks like. I don't know the total number of MTWs right now. There were 19 when we started out. And
139 is the number they're up to these days. 139.
whoa, look, see how that's grown? I mean, just in like 10, 15 years. I mean, it's like, what's that, 5, 6 times it's grown. So that's really good. So anyway, yeah, occasionally we've had some Appropriation Act requirements added on to these MTWs, but for the most part, it's a very flexible program. They're a group of PHAs that are strongly aligned with each other. You'll find that out if you carve out something for one, the next day everybody knows, and they want the same thing. So another key program with some special powers is this Choice Neighborhoods Demonstration Program. And a bunch of you have had transactions that are combined with Choice. And we've been, because it's, all one HUD, we've allowed them to be superior to RAD whenever we're talking about, is the RAD use agreement first, or is the Choice regulatory agreement first? And it's the Choice. Now, if we're talking about FHA, we know that RAD is first and FHA goes second. And that's just a programmatic departmental decision. But I think the reason for Choice being first is because it is a standalone demonstration program, the way the funding goes and the period of time that it goes till. The funding has been kind of meager for that, so it helps a little bit, but not the way any of us had hoped. You've probably noticed some big differences between small PHA's participation in RAD and the larger ones. In fact, there's a lot of guidance out there about, how can a small PHA do RAD versus how the medium and the larger ones do. And, I think part of the goal is to get a lot of these small ones out of the public housing program. There's all these incentives that have been built in. But they have some incentives already, just like the MTWs have flexibility with OP and CAP. So do the small PHAs. They just don't have the ability to combine the Section 8 money that they might be getting. Another important thing about public housing is the participation of residents, whether They have resident organizations that are recognized because they've been duly elected under 964, or whether we're talking about resident advocacy on the board. With a couple of exceptions, every PHA has to have a resident on the board. It can be a public housing resident or a Section 8 resident if, they're administering both. Another important sort of special thing about the CAP money is the time period on it. 2 years to obligate, 4 years to expend. And the good thing, if you're doing a RAD and you have a CHAP, we did a notice that allows you to extend the period of time. So we don't allow you to extend just the expenditure period, but we allow you to extend with HUD approval the obligation period. So rather than 2 years, you could say 4 or 5 years. The RAD notice talks a little bit about this. So, and by extending the obligation period, you've extended the expenditure period. And, because these RAD deals are often complex, time consuming, it's important to have a little extra time. So you don't want them to lose the money, but they have to keep aware of that timing, because, there's an end of the road on the money. And again, Mr. Kaufman can tell you where the end of the road is, because otherwise the money has to be recaptured. Goes back to treasure. There's this tolling statute, that can only go so far. So that's why that matters to you. So you want to make sure the housing authorities are on top of that. Of course, there's always the ability for regulatory and ACC waivers. The way we treat waivers in public housing, they would have to be approved by the Assistant Secretary or currently by the GDAS. They are first sent to OGC. We look at them, and if we don't see any legal objection, we send them back to PIH and they can sign off on them. They usually are through like a SharePoint system with the field offices, bringing them up. If the field office rejects a waiver, I'll never see it unless the PHA comes back to headquarters and says, hey, why did we lose this? And so then once it's approved and the PHA finds out about it, we publish these regulatory waivers quarterly, just the way housing, it publishes their regulatory waivers quarterly. And they're of all types. Of course, a reg waiver is only of a regulation. It seems kind of like master the obvious, but if what's in the reg is actually part of the statute, then you can't waive it. Can't waive a statute unless the statute, we have regulatory authority. Like, the CARES Act gave us some statutory authorities to waive. The ARA, the Recovery Act program, we had some statutory waiver authority. But, some people try to be a little clever and they think, oh, you have the statutory authority. Well, can you waive this? Can the statutory authority apply to the statute itself? Like, well, no, it's of another section, of 37 Act, for example. So, ACC waivers, it works the same way. Most of the ACC waivers that I see relate to conflicts of interest. We have conflicts of interest requirements in public housing, and it's also in Part 200, the grant OMB requirements. Okay, so that's enough of that. Let's take a minute and talk about enforcement. So, you often hear about enforcement coming in, whenever they're asking for a CHAP. And we're finding out, oh, they have a VCA, or they have a DEC review, a Department of Enforcement Center review, or an IG review, what's going on. Or maybe PIH is taking some sort of enforcement look at this housing authority. And so I just wanted to tell you sort of what is the powers of enforcement, so that, you won't be surprised when you hear about something like this. So the basic one is 6J of the 37 Act. And that is basically if a housing authority is found to be troubled. There are various remedies that we can take under 6J. We can get a receiver. We can take possession. We can withhold money, we can cancel contracts. Lots of powers there if they're troubled. And that 6J, it's mentioned in the ACC, but more clearly in Part 907. That's the substantial default provision. Part 200, the program regs also have the same kind of remedies like withhold, terminate, um, you know, some sort of like special action kind of arrangement, sort of like what we do in FARS. That's that PHA recovery and sustainability thing. We basically enter into a recovery agreement. They have an action plan with a timetable and a sustainability plan that sort of says, how do you keep this thing going? I mean, we have one current example of that is in Durham, North Carolina. They are subject to a recovery agreement having to do with this McDougal Terrace project. And basically, we were trying to rat it, but then, it got to be so bad. It was just like, I didn't think that RECAP could handle that. It was just like too much. And so and this was a good cooperative thing. Public housing stepped in, did as far as recovery, worked with the local the city in that case, trying to come up with this plan. So I think that should sort of give you like what we can do as far as enforcement. Litigation. Okay. So the way we treat litigation, other than when the department is sued and with justice would get involved, but whenever a PHA is either the plaintiff or the defendant in a case, they are supposed to report their litigation to us through our regional and field counsel. And that's all spelled out in this litigation handbook. And it also spells out requirements for whenever there is a settlement. And if the settlement is going to involve use of grant dollars and there hasn't been a quote violation of law, we'll send it forward if we agree to GDAS in this case to approve the settlement. If it does involve the use of funds where there has been a violation of law, she has to approve that too. We haven't approved those. We basically tell them to go find some non-federal funds to take care of that. So, and the same thing about this, I have listed the legal services addendum engagement agreement. Whenever a housing authority engages counsel, and they could engage counsel to do a RAD deal. They could engage counsel to go to their board meetings, draft things, resolutions for them. This legal services contract is also supposed to be reviewed by field counsel. And just like any other procurement in public housing, the term should not exceed 5 years. That's what we felt to be a full and open competition for legal services is a service, just like if you're, getting trash service, so is the legal service, right? Hopefully it's not the same as trash, but anyway, they have to do this agreement. And basically it outlines what their activities can be, the scope of their activities. In other words, don't use this contract to fight the department. Don't use this contract to also impede investigations. So why do you care about this? Well, the legal opinion that we get from the PHA's counsel, they tell us whether or not there's any litigation pending that would have an impact on the RAD project, the continuing viability of the project. And, usually they just say there is none, but sometimes they'll list them and we'll have to go through and say, or ask for more information, like how is this going to affect the development or the operation. So that's why it matters. Okay, so I'm going to take a quick little break here. And I'm going to ask you if you have any questions before we move on to ownership and control. Okay. Just popping up my outline for me. I'll keep the outline simple for you, but so that was like, about a half an hour of the nuts and bolts, the nitty gritty of public housing. I hope it made sense. But if it doesn't, you always can call me. If there's something that's a peculiar public housing question, let's talk about it. If you think it has an impact on the RAD deal that you're looking at. Okay. All right, then, John, I think we're ready for ownership and control. Are you ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so this was an area that John had specifically asked for, and I could talk about public housing all day long, but he was interested in that. And so I did give you that component one and the RAD prac ownership and control. And I think it's pretty clear in the RAD statute about the control on the first component. This says the secretary shall require ownership or control of assisted housing by a public or nonprofit entity. Public, PHA, nonprofit, okay, you know what that is. And then this is the thing that really gives us a little more flexibility as far as the ownership and control, and that is the secretary may allow ownership to be transferred to a for-profit entity to facilitate the use of tax credits only if the public housing agency preserves its interest in a property in a manner approved by the secretary. And that's the key. How do they preserve their interest in the property? So what we did in the RAD notice most recently in September 2019 is in section 1.4A11 to talk about how they can satisfy this interest. So I'm not going to read those all to you, but needless to say, fee simple interest, that means they have outright ownership of the property. That's good. They have a ground lease. That's good. They have direct or indirect authority, like they have a contract, a partnership share, an agreement, some sort of thing like that. With respect to the RAD units, that's good. 51% or more of the general partners, cool. So those are the things, and at the very end, there's this one, other ownership or control arrangements approved by HUD. So that's where we get those control agreements. They were initially kind of popular a few years ago. I don't see them very often anymore. I think the reason is when they started structuring those, and I started seeing them happen mainly with mixed finance. And so they already had these R&O arrangements with the PHA. So they were basically taking those as sort of a master agreement. Well, the thing is, once they did that, they thought, wait a minute, after they had said, do you want, can we accept these? And we said, yes, we can accept these. And based upon, what rights that the PHA retained, then they started arguing too much, they meaning the PHA and this other entity. And so I think we're kind of back to like not doing control agreements. I can think of 5 or 6 off the top of my head and it was fortunate that they had a control agreement, but they also had a ground lease. And I'm thinking, why did you ever bother binding yourself up with a control agreement when you had a ground lease? That seems like you're just asking for trouble. But anyway, we have approved those things. Our field council, takes the first look. They have a question. They come to me on ownership and control. There's another section specifically on the tax credit. And so I think that's all really, really clear.
Vickie, is there
Yeah.
generally a minimum term for the ground lease that we would want to see?
Yeah. my minimum, the Vickie
Okay.
minimum is 50 years.
Okay.
And I always see them longer than that. You got to figure, how long do we think the Section 8 is going to work? I mean, in public housing, well, okay, if you're going to do FHA, we're going to say 75 if they're involved. If we were just doing public housing, we'd say 40. But, we're kind of beyond that, but we're maybe not as far as FHA. So I'm saying 50 is a compromise. And most of the time I see more than 50. I see the 60, 70. And one of the reasons, Alan, I think that we see longer terms is because the PHA is actually making money off of this. They're getting payments for years out of the ground lease. I don't know if you've seen it, but I often look to see sort of what the arrangement is. And sometimes it's just, a couple bucks, but most of the time, like if you're looking at like Philadelphia, the housing authority is making a lot of money out of the ground leases. And what are they doing to get that? Just being the ground lessor. That's all they're doing, on paper. So, anyway, so let's go through some examples. So where the PHA would continue to own the project, is that clearly acceptable? Sure. If they're going to transfer it to an affiliate where the PHA is the owner or the member, sure. Affiliates are good. Instrumentalities are good. Those are defined in Part 905, 24 CFR Part 905. They're also there's a couple notices on affiliates and instrumentalities we had to do whenever we were first doing the mixed finance. What about if the PHA transfers the ownership to another public or nonprofit entity? Good. Okay, so I have some examples of what are potentially acceptable, subject to review. What about ownership by a LIHTC entity? So if it's for purposes of facilitating these tax credits and they transfer the ownership to a tax credit entity, usually a limited partner or a limited liability company, what we have to review is to ensure that that PHA has adequate control and consent rights. The review is necessary whether the PHA is the general partner or the managing member or one of multiple general partners or a managing partner. So what I tell the field counsel to do, they have to ensure that that entity is in existence for at least as long as the HAP contract. And they have to ensure that the HUD required provisions, and at the end of the attachment that I gave you, there's a list of those HUD required provisions. Make sure those are in the owner entity's governing documents, and then we should be okay. What if we have a long-term ground lease? This was Alan's answer. Sure. And especially where that's for the purpose of facilitating tax credits. So the PHA is able to maintain adequate control over the property for this period, with the PHA being the lessor and the project owner entity being the lessee. All we just make sure is that that PHA is keeping enough control and that the ground lease is just not a de facto irrevocable transfer of a fee interest. So it's like, is this a sham or not a sham, right? So the field counsel will look on the ground lease. I mean, I don't want you all to feel like you have to take any of this on, but I want you to understand that they'll look at the term of the ground lease. They'll look for those required provisions. Okay. Next structure. And I'm going to tell you up front, these are structures that present serious concerns and really need much more review. And this first one would be seller financing or other subordinate loans. So, a PHA can transfer ownership of the project to a tax credit entity to maintain control. Cool. But that seller financing or those subordinate loans, how are they secured? Do they give the PHA a legal interest in the property? And how limited is that interest? So the problem with a subordinate lien is, it's terminated if the superior lien forecloses. So like, where does that leave the PHA? So, the lien is limited to the amount of financing. The lien, would terminate when the loan was due and repaid. So therefore, the PHA's interest, if it's limited to the amount of financing, and it provides that it can be extinguished when the loan is repaid, we got a problem. So I think what we're looking for is a transaction where the PHA maintains control throughout the seller financing period, with or without adequate ownership interest is what we're looking for. And if they would just top it off, it's like a sundae with the cherry on top, throw the ground lease in there, and then we can forget about all this seller financing stuff. Sometimes they think it's really great to have a right of first refusal. Really that doesn't buy you too much, because the problem is, once that right of first refusal lapses, the PHA's rights could be lost. Or, hey, what if the PHA can't feasibly pay the purchase price? What good is this? It's nice. I used to see a lot of these in mixed finance. They're throwaways, and I don't think it adds any security to what we're looking for in ownership and control. So I'd say they're like I said, they're not worth much. I don't know if they could somehow wrap it with something else. Okay, but by itself, it's never been enough. Okay, so ask me a question if you like on any of that ownership and control for component one. I'll tell you guys are just soaking this all up, right? Okay, so let's jump into rad for prac. And by the way, John,
We have a hand.
think I
Yeah,
see a
Kimberly.
hand. Kimberly,
Yeah.
let's go. Okay.
I'm so sorry. I just couldn't make my hand work.
Yeah,
So I
probably
won't be
couldn't even
shy.
find my hand. Okay.
So if you don't mind, I do have a question, and it's about the ownership control, but it's also touches on a risk issue. So let me just give a quick scenario. If you have a housing authority that is layering, this is under component one, where they're layering a transaction with LIHTCs. A lot of those R&Os have, the investor has put language in some of those agreements to remove the managing member should they become problematic, or, various, they can basically put whatever information they want to in there to justify that kind of removal. It has to be extreme, right? So,
Yeah.
but let's say it happens. So then you've already closed, you're already in, full operations, and the managing member is removed. So the project is no longer technically controlled by the housing authority, even if it was the affiliate or the instrumentality of the housing authority that was in that ownership position. So then what?
Then what? They got to come to HUD. It's not enough. It's in that R&O. Big deal. Basically, the rad use agreement says something other than that. If there's a change in ownership, they have to come back to us. It's nice that they can have their little policies. That's what an R&O is, a policy. We're not approving their R&Os. That's their thing, right? But the higher force, the higher source is the R&O. So, like I said, so what? That's there. Any change in ownership comes back to us. That's a simple answer. And that gives us a whole lot of discretion and time to deal with problems like that. I mean, I have seen a few, not for that reason, not for poor performance. I've seen changes in ownership. And, you know, I'm not always sure why there's a change. Sometimes it's just because they're going out and getting more financing, and so they're reconstituting their boards and things. But I'd say don't worry about the Arno.
Thank
Okay?
you.
All right. So, well, unless there's another hand going up real fast, if Kimberly can find the hand, I guess you all can too. I think it, I see where it is now. It says reaction. There's a little happy face and a hand. That's that must be the button, right, Kimberly? That's the hand button. Okay. So let's talk about rad prac ownership and control. So, you know, it's a beautiful thing that, you know, we can now do the 202 rad pracs. You know, I I initially was a little sad when I should probably admit this to this rad group, but I was a little sad whenever I sort of saw all my babies in public housing becoming Section 8. You know, I had some pride in some of those because we had done mixed finance or we did cap fund finance. You know, we developed a lot of capacity with a lot of PHAs. But, you know, sometimes there's never enough money to go around, and the pot and the grass was greener in Section 8. And so, you know, I became a believer because, you know, wanting to preserve it. But I feel even more strongly about this 202 stuff and the 811s because my predecessor and mentor, Betty Park, who had done 202 since the beginning of time, whenever the Cranston-Gonzalez Act came about in 1988, 89, she called it the new program, the supportive housing for the elderly, and it's the PrAC program and supportive house for the disabled. She goes, Vickie, you get this. And I'd been her understudy, you know, for years. And she, I should tell you, Betty Park worked for the department until she was 93. Amazing person. And so she goes, Vickie, this new program is yours. I'm like, okay. So, you know, I helped housing, you know, write the regs, do all the forms, do the guidance materials, get the PA, you know, the field council started and closing these, and, you know, things are going great. Well, I knew it was going to be just like public housing. You can only go so long on PrAC assistance and the rent. You're not going to get that much in rents. So what do? And you get this, and you get this lifeline to continue. So it was 200, Section 237 of 2018 Appropriation Act that permitted this. And John, I noticed today you're asking for comments on 811. So, you know, it's going to come around. I've been, oh, thank you, Alan. 19, I knew it was 89, 90. I wasn't sure exactly what part of the year it was. But anyway, I had been wondering, like, what are we going to do with 811? Because that housing is a lot harder to build. It's small, and I understand the deals are going to be a little more, you know, difficult in a sense. But so I noticed out on your, you call it your reviewing table in multifamily, you're asking for public comment to help us get started on that. But in the meantime, we are doing the 202 rad pracs. And so basically, the one key difference, these these second components of RAD, they don't have that same broad statutory waiver authority as the first component, but it does give us this little phrase, subject to requirements established by the secretary. And so, you know, in the 2019 revision of the RAD demo, we basically have used this authority and standard regulatory waiver authority to develop some alternative requirements. And so some of this, you know, comes forth in the alternative requirements that we have put out for 202. The other interesting thing, I sort of like on top of all this, Congress said to us, you know, you need to keep those sort of same safeguards that you had in the 202 program, the Capital Advance program, in your RAD 202 RAD Prac program. So like, and I think that's sort of important because that actually allows us to keep these units going even longer. So let's say there was like 15 years still remaining under their capital advance. Well, we take that 15 and add it on to the new elderly use agreement HAP contract. So I think, that's really, really special to be able to do that. So first of all, we need to talk about who is an eligible owner for this ownership control. So it has to be a current owner in good standing. And if the current owner is anticipated to remain in the ownership structure, great. The only problem, we'll have to make sure that there's no history of non-compliance or some sort of contractual problem we've had with them, and the housing itself is in good shape. So if the proposed conversion is like in the context of a acquisition simultaneous with conversion, then they have to provide us evidence of successful owning and operating HUD or other multifamily housing properties. And if there's going to be a change in ownership, then they're going to have to do the 25/30 previous participation approval requirement. And I think this is kind of interesting. One thing John has been working on with, I guess, the field offices is the ability to sort of, it's almost like a fair cloth situation, only for 202. So you have a brand new capital advance, right? And you want to basically get it built and ready for occupancy, and then boom, convert it. And I think, then the ownership is quite clear. It's been established, it's not changing, and it's suddenly becoming 202 RAD Prac. So that's one quick way, providing, or if the ownership is not changing at all. So that's good. Another thing on eligible ownership, we got to make sure that the fair housing and civil rights compliance is shipshape. So let's talk about the actual ownership and control requirements. So basically, it has to be owned or controlled by a nonprofit entity. Whenever these 202s were created, usually it started out with a sponsor entity, which may or may not have been a nonprofit. Usually they were like the umbrella agency, but then they created these single purpose nonprofits to actually operate and own these. Because what we didn't want to be dealing with these monolithic type of sponsor nonprofits. We wanted these individual nonprofits, and that's what we're still requiring. So it has to be one of those types of nonprofits that has a tax exempt status under 501c3 or C4, or is a nonprofit consumer cooperative or nonprofit affiliate with a public agency. I have not seen more than 2 or 3 consumer cooperative nonprofits. And surprisingly, they were in Puerto Rico. I don't know why only there, but that's the only place. And since we started doing these deals, I haven't seen one of those. Or a nonprofit affiliate of a public agency. So, most of the time, we are doing these to become PBRAs. But sometimes we've had now some PBVs, and that's where you're going to get these nonprofit affiliates with a public agency, with the PHAs. Okay, so these nonprofit ownership or controls, how do they satisfy this? It's almost identical to what we talked about a little bit ago in component 1. You got a fee simple interest in the real property. Own it right out. You own that covered project. Beautiful. That's the easiest thing ever. Or how about being a lessor in a ground lease? Again, easy. And then the rest of these other ones are like if you have direct or indirect legal authority relating to directing the financial or legal interests of the project owner. that's kind of like some of the things we look at in those control agreements I'd mentioned to you before. Or you start getting into the percentages. You know, do you own 51% or more of a general partner interest in a limited partnership, that kind of thing. So prior to conversion, though, I'm just going to say these converting properties have to continue to meet all of the Housing Act of 1959 as amended. And when I talk about the 59 Act, that goes back to like the direct loans. That is not the capital advance program. It's that as amended, the Cranston-Gonzalez amendments. So that's what you got to have. At the very end of the attachment I gave you, there are the instructions. So there's the first set of instructions are for if you have LIHTC deals and what kind of language you need to put in to your ownership agreements. The second attachment is if it's a ground lease, what kind of provisions do we have to see in the ground lease? Our field counsel looks for these. You know, they're not reading the whole document, but they're looking for this stuff. And then the third thing is if the project owner is a PHA instrumentality or affiliate, and sort of like what those are. So those are that's the key language. Let's want to talk about this anymore. Is there anything that's confusing that I said about ownership and control for 202 red pracs?
I think that was helpful, Vicky, and there really is a real direct correlation between the public housing side, right, and the PRAC side. PRAC was really modeled after how we implement public housing.
And I think, you know, even though we don't have all the flexibility that we do in component one, I think we have enough. I mean, have you ever found, John, that we didn't have enough flexibility?
No, I think with the PRAC owners, the rent setting issues was probably the hardest thing for them, but they
Yeah.
figured that out, right?
Yeah.
I think that was the hardest part for them, but I think now, it's usually owned and operated by a nonprofit, so that seems pretty straightforward to carry that forward, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
not a heavy lift on the ownership and control side for them, and even when they bring in a development partner to do a tax credit transaction.
Right. I think the harder part though is the PBV. You know,
Yeah, well, for
and
sure.
you know, for the life of me, I don't know why we ever allowed PHAs to play in that pool. You know, I told you why in my
Yeah.
remarks, but you know, they were not the type of entity that, you know, we initially thought would be successful. But you know, there they are, and our RAD demonstration notice basically says they get to pick if they want to be PBV or PBRA, RAD for pracs.
Right.
Of course, you have to have a PHA that's willing, you know,
Right.
to take it on if it's going to be PBV.
Yeah, and I think, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's just so interesting when we started the PRAC program, like we didn't, I think we did not anticipate through the door, right? There'd be a couple housing authorities. Oh, I own 9 of these. I own 2 or 3 of these, and yeah, they were gung ho because they converted their public housing stock, right? So like, oh, I love this RAD program. I'll do it. I'll do it here too. Give me this PV, convert
Grab
to
some
PVV.
fees. I don't want to give up
Yeah.
this property.
Yeah,
I know.
Right.
It's the problem though is that funding period, that cycle. It's
Yep.
just not, it's not lickety split. There's this huge delay. And you know, the other interesting thing is, especially when you're dealing with PHAs, and a lot of these 202s had some subordinate grants. Most of it wasn't financing, most of it was grants. And so whether it was like a block grant, you know, a CBG grant, or home, they were set up as always subordinate, right? But when you get these PHAs wanting to, and I found this out with San Francisco, they think, oh, well, we're lifting off, we're terminating all of that capital advance stuff. Ooh, my loan is getting higher there. It's higher in the pecking order. Well, no, it isn't. You know, basically, oh, I thought somebody was laughing about my hands going into the air. But anyway, they thought that they were going to improve their position, and that's not what the statute says. You know, if anything, you know, we have to maintain that same order, that same preference, that same control that we had in the capital advance program. So, you know, once you're second, you're always second. You know, you're not going to jump up to first. And I think, you know, they got a little greedy. But you know, I think we controlled that. So, well, if that is enough on ownership and control, let's talk about what it is that I think I've learned, and we'll go through these, and maybe we'll toss some of these around back and forth. Okay. I, I think the number one thing is the importance of these initial calls that we have, getting the deal started, having everybody talk. What is the deal? All the people in the room that need to be there, recap, PHA, OGC, just so we can be on the same page. We can figure out what everybody's expectations are. And, you know, if we can't meet their expectations, we'll tell them why, and when we will make it. But I think, you know, I never used to sit in on any of those with the component one deals. I mean, I knew about them, but whenever I was doing all of the first, like, I don't know, 17 or 18 202 rep pracs, I sat in on those calls, and I thought they were so incredibly valuable. Um, and I was really amazed and pleased at how the recap, like the closing coordinators especially, were helping to facilitate and talk through those calls. Because you know, it's one thing, you know, to get through all the paperwork, to get your chap, or, you know, to get the okay, your approval for your 202 rad prac. But it's another thing to have that personal contact, you know, knowing that they can call, you know, whoever, you know, Cheryl Felton, they can call Cheryl, right? And Cheryl will be there for them. And I think that's really, really good. That I don't know, John, how do you feel about that? I mean, that I put that as my number one thing, because I just think it's a people thing as well as a process thing.
Yeah, I'll second that. Shout out to Cheryl Felton.
She's wonderful. You're
Yeah,
all wonderful, but
yeah,
you know, she was my first call, you know, and
yeah,
then Nicole, you know, she jumped in,
yep,
and she was fantastic.
yep.
And I just felt there was this deep appreciation of HUD staff, of recap staff, and the professionalism and the responsiveness that they show. I mean, they're quick. It's amazing, given all the things that they have to do. So that's my number one. Number two, this sounds kind of doctrinaire, but fill in the blanks and don't start freelancing or changing. I say this more often than you ever know on, like, the PHA and the owner legal opinions. Now that we have a real PRA form for those, you know, we were operating under model forms for so long. I'll say to them, fill in the blanks. You know, you have the ability to put in some qualifications and assumptions, but they can't, you know, basically undo what that opinion is that we need to get. And, you know, I've been really, really pleased and lucky for the most part with that. I mean, the NYCHA deals kind of went, you know, in a different direction, and that's just because there were so many different counsel involved. You know, and even though we're looking for the total opinion, and that total opinion can be made up of like 7 opinions, as long as what we're looking for, the ultimate opinion, is there in one of those pieces, you know, that they're all providing. But, you know, I guess you probably figure this out about lawyers. You know, they always want to, like, fine tune and craft things, right? And it's like, you know, I'm like, cut it out. You know, we went through the PRA notice and public comment process. And we listened and we took your advice. And if you want any more changes, come see me in 3 years when we do PRA again. I'm so serious about that. I'm pretty doctrinaire, and my field council know that. They know if somebody's asking for something, they have to come to me. If whether they think those assumptions and qualifications are exceeding sort of what we need as an opinion, or they're trying to change some of the basic words. The only thing that we have dabbled in lately is what is local law. That's kind of an amorphous thing. What is local law? Obviously we care about the 37 Act, right? Obviously, we care about fair housing and environmental laws and all that. But, these different, just got a message. My next call is canceled. So, we had to like fine tune that a little bit. And so my field council now have, as far as local law, we can accept yet another opinion to deal with local law, or they can tell us how they're dealing with local law in different ways. Sometimes it'll be through the title opinion on some of the local zoning kind of things that might have an impact. But it is important. I mean, Tom and I talked. I don't know, is Tom on this call today? I just didn't even look to see if he called in.
I don't think he's
No.
gonna be able to make it.
Okay. Just because he and I talked about this at some length about how deep we wanted to get on local law, and we decided just to say it, and we'll see what they come back with. And when we did the PRA, nobody came back on us to ask us what were the bounds of this. So anyway, and I feel the same way about all the other forms. Fill in the blanks. Don't start changing. Don't even try to change the rad use agreement, or I mean, the most that we did for like the termination agreement with the 202 rad prac was, I think it was Philadelphia. They said, well, you have like 3 or 4 things that you're terminating. You can't terminate all those things in one document. So we want a separate document for each of those things. Personally, I think that recorder's office was just wanting the money for the recording fees. They wanted them separate. I couldn't believe it because I never had to do that in mixed finance. I don't know why, but suddenly, new recorder, new rules. But fill in the blanks. Okay. My next one is, and I say this to my field council, if you're in doubt, just ask. Don't be bashful, just ask me. And, I'm pretty responsive, I think. I answer phone calls and emails. So, and the same thing with me. If I have some doubt about something I read, like in your transaction review committee memo, John, I'll ask you, before we have our meetings, before you do your RCC. I think, if something's not looking right, ask the question. Maybe it's just a phrasing issue. Maybe there's just more facts that I'm not aware of. Fourth, stay involved and follow up. It's kind of the same thing. Just stay on top of your deals. Stay on top of your field council. I think you all know that our rule of thumb is when they have a complete package, they get 2 weeks to respond and with their comments. And then after that, it's kind of up to the other outside parties to get back to them, or if you have comments, for you to coordinate with the field council. But it gets a little tough, the end of the last quarter of the year with, it's really tough in September, the end of September, end of the fiscal year, and then it gets tough again in November and December because that's an attractive time to close. So, number 5, expect and plan for delays with old DOTs and property descriptions. And I kind of alluded to this in my earlier comments to you. Like these DOTs, some of them I swear are as old as dirt. They're as old as the public housing program itself. And some of those descriptions are so funny to read. There'd be no way a current surveyor could go out and really follow those. meets and bounds, because they're usually not meets and bounds in a general sense. We have never accepted just an address, because you know how easy it is to change a street name or something. But you know, descriptions change also, just because of, you know, maybe a road went in, you know, some other kind of easement. Maybe the housing authority sold some of the property. Maybe they didn't release from DOT the stuff they sold, you know. So you find out all of these like quirky things, or you find out they never put a new DOT on. And that's one thing. If they didn't put, like, let's say the old one expired, those old bond DOTs, and they didn't put a new one in. If we find out there's no DOT on the property, we'll say, if you're not going to close in 30 days, you're going to put a new DOT on it. That's just a safeguard, you know, so we don't have to deal with any intervening liens. But, you know, I've often said we have a constructive DOT, a constructive use agreement, by virtue of the statute. The statute creates this restriction. You get money, you spend it on a public housing project, there's a use restriction that goes through. So it's like constructive, even though it might not be actually recorded. The statute doesn't say we have to actually record. It's the ACC that says to record. And that's kind of a legal nicety to do it. But still, I mean, what does any member of the public, or, you know, a professional business do when they're dealing with a PHA in a particular piece of property? I think they want to know if these use restrictions are on there before they start giving you a loan. They need to know that they're in second place, and sort of like, how big is this property? So anyway, we often find the need for new DOTs, new legal descriptions, new surveys, but I try to be like really easy on the new surveys if I can, relying upon existing surveys. Sometimes we can do it just with surveyors' explanations, and we'll attach those sometimes to the legal description, so that the next person that comes around, and that's the key, you know. We want to leave things as good or better than we found them, you know, going forward. You know, we want to have a good use agreement on the property to protect the investment that the department has in this affordable housing. Okay, number 6. Avoid PHAs contracting with themselves. Ask for a PHA legal opinion. You know, this comes up a lot. They think they can do it all. You know, they think they can be the owner, the contract administrator, the owner under the HAP, you know, and quite honestly, they can't. And so sometimes it's not enough for us to tell them. We just say, okay, you know, give us a legal opinion. And that's when they kind of quickly figure it out, when they talk to their own counsel, and they kind of get that. But that's really something that I think the field office, that's their responsibility. It's not so much OGC. I mean, we'll confirm or deny kind of thing, but the field office sort of does that cut. The public housing field office does that cut. And then, you know, if they're having problems, then I always tell them to ask the PHA to go out and get a legal opinion. Then we'll look at it. You know, we're not trying to be paternalistic and second guess them. We want them to think about what they're doing and the consequences. All right, number 7, HUD and PHA partners, steadfastness and ingenuity. You know, the last RAD notice, I think, got into this more than others, especially when we started talking about the fair cloth stuff, and trying to get housing authorities to work with each other. You know, like local, like 2 different like county housing authority and the city housing authority. You know, how can they sort of combine their efforts? Or a housing authority that's going out of business and they still have some assets. You know, what can you do with those assets? I guess I'm always excited when something like that happens, or just, you know, whenever, our office, your office comes up with things. I don't know, John, is there something lately that you thought was particularly ingenious or really sort of advancing of sort of like the partnership we're trying to create?
Yeah, kind of scaring me a little bit, but I think it's a neat direction. We are seeing more of our programs just kind of fall together, like RAD for public housing and 202 capital advance, RAD for public housing and RAD
Yeah.
for PRAC and Section APB. They're starting to like use not just the tools that RAD has
Yeah.
provided at their disposal, but the tools that HUD as a whole has provided at their disposal. So I think we will see some more of that, and we're seeing that with Faircloth too.
I think the federal practice group is probably a good example of ingenuity. That RAD resource desk, I think, is amazing. Especially, when I started doing the 202 RAD PRAC reviews, to be able to go on there and have this resource that keeps track of everything. Initially, it wasn't keeping track of things very well, and I kind of complained, and we got that straightened out. But it's just great. It's all there. You can see the closing coordinator comments. You can see the revisions. You can track the deal. And it's a far cry from, I keep saying this, my mixed finance days, because half of my mixed finance control was in my head, because I was getting things here and there and different times and then over a long period of time. I mean, it was nuts. It was so hard, trying to remember and coordinate. And that resource desk is a thing of beauty when you get into the deal specifics. It's nice too to have all the forms and the information, but I think that was, I don't know if any other part of HUD has anything quite like that to sort of manage processes like that. I think it's really great. So that's what I had in mind, John. I thought that was the thing that you guys have really excelled at. Okay. Next thing, when do public housing rules apply? And when can you use public housing grant funds? And I touched on that. I think, until you get yourself to closing, you're under public housing rules for the most part, unless you're going to do an early start or an early demo or something like that. You're following public housing rules. You're using public housing money as public housing money. And then at closing, you get to put that money over the line into Section 8, and then Section 8 applies. So,
Vickie, just briefly mention the rule about pre-development expenses prior to the closing.
right. There are limits on how much you can spend in pre-development without HUD approval. That's the one you're asking me about in particular?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So, it's not a blank check. There's a cap on that. But then if they want to spend more, okay, then you just have to get public housing's approval for the extra development money. Because the thing about it is, the pre-development stuff is supposed, and I should probably pull out my regs, but there's a description of what pre-development is. It's like your drawings, your planning, you're preparing the site, but that's kind of where it stops. You're not actually doing a foundation. That's not pre-development. That is development. So, you have to sort of draw the line there. Is there more, Alan, on that point?
No, that was it.
Okay. Okay, great. So, number 9, complexity for smaller PHAs. Yeah. I always knew it was a problem. It's a problem for them and how they participate in public housing. And part of it, is, their own small staff. It's a big program, this public housing program, and then telling them they're going to change to Section 8 and like, what's that mean? Some of them get really good consultants and away they go, and some of them get really good counsel and away they go. But, it's the ones that try to do it themselves, these do-it-yourselfers. Yeah. But it is more complex for them, and just trying to make the deal work. I think, John, you can maybe speak to that. It's
Yeah.
like, they knew the sort of like how to limp along with public housing.
Yeah, we
But
were on a panel call yesterday. Small PHA, 170 odd units,
uh-huh.
about 20 scattered site units, one other, larger public housing development. They actually had 1,000 vouchers in their program. I thought that was
Oh,
like, wow,
that's
okay.
big. Yeah.
Right, yeah, that's what we thought too. And like, yeah, we want to do, the home ownership for our scattered site because they're single family homes, and also do 8Y under the voucher program, so voucher holders can use that for home, to pursue home ownership. And
Yeah.
then we want to redevelop this small site and maybe either use RAD or Section E3 blend. And
Wanna.
yeah, no, and
Like,
and
whoa.
and and we're thinking about Faircloth, and I went, whoa. And well, that's great. Why don't we give you some free technical assistance and kind of help you on your way so you don't have, but they knew what they wanted, they just don't know how to get there, right? And so
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
right. They need help.
They need help. And there was a group that Chad and Kathy Siebitz and I and some others, and we did put together those sort of conversions for the different sizes. They're not one size fits all. We had for the smalls, for the mediums, for the largest, like sort of like helping them understand sort of what the options are. And I think, you know, back when the pandemic started, um, and the CARES Act money was going out, I think everybody in public housing, small, medium, or large, they all kind of froze because they didn't know what to expect. Like, do I keep going? Do I start this thing? You know, is the funding going to change? There was like, not only did they have a lot of options, technically speaking, but it was that uncertainty, like, with the financial markets, the supply chains. I mean, it was paralyzing, I think, for them, and more so for the small ones. Um, not knowing like what's the better deal. Is public housing going to be a better deal for me than RAD? And and I think there's a bit of a tug of war, sort of different constituencies want different things, and one size doesn't fit all. But and even with the properties, and it is kind of a shame. A lot of these small ones have a lot of scattered sites, units, single family homes, and those are incredibly hard to manage. um, but in certain localities, that's what they have, and that's they never went for building multifamily buildings. And even after we get into RAD, there's still a problem. you know and so a lot of times, we're getting some that have a large number of these. We're not talking just about Philadelphia with its large number of scattered site single families, but other places, in Portland, Spokane, Arizona. I forget the name of that community, but they all had a lot of these. And so I think, RAD made it more possible to do the home ownership programs. Maybe not on the scale that Philadelphia wanted initially, but to be able to say, okay, you can sell those at fair market value and try to sell them to your existing tenants if you can, work out something for them, and then take that money and use it for other affordable housing. Because like I said, it's not a good model, this home ownership model for RAD. I don't think it was never really a good model for public housing. We've tried a lot of different things, turnkey 3, where you've sort of like your rent becomes like your interest payment. So you end up sort of buying at the end, It never worked out that well. And even the homeownership programs under Hope 6 never worked out that well. And part of it is we had to put so many layers of assistance to even make them work for those families. So anyway, complexity for small PHAs. Fair cloth to rad. So, this was something I always thought was back there. It just had to get a little more interest to it. I remember further back whenever some of the PHA said, well, I have, this fair cloth ability. Why can't I, quote, convert it? Well, you can't convert something that doesn't physically exist. It can't just exist on paper. You have to create the unit that you're going to convert, because once you have the unit, then you'll have the assistance. And that assistance is what you're going to actually, convert with the property. And I think, all the things that we've learned in mixed finance and how to move it, and by combining the mixed finance method with fair cloth, we can get to RAD a lot quicker with brand new stuff. I mean, the first thing we did with Baltimore, was a good test, and then I think there's Galveston and some others that are coming along there, and I think that's really healthy, because we are managing that ability. I guess, if you get the ability to do more rent boosting, John, this will be even better, if that is something that public housing is willing to do, because it's just another method. I mean, we took away the fair cloth ability for the smalls, which is probably the right thing that we did in that demo dispo notice. We said, hey, if you're was it under, I forget, 250 or something like that, we're not going to let you continue to be in public housing. You're out. Once you convert, you're out. But there is a lot of fair cloth ability still out there. And the other thing is, it is an asset. And so, why don't you try using that asset, with another local housing authority to make something better? That is a lesson still to be learned, I guess. We're not quite there yet. Number 11, RAD post-closing challenges and coordination. So, it's all fun and games to get closing and you think you're done, but sometimes you're never done, because, they basically underestimated what the properties really needed, or they didn't get their tax credits in time, and so they're coming back, or there's problems with ownership like we talked about, and so they want to come back. And I think, Kyra just sent me something the other day about, a little more guidance out there on how to do these post-closing things, and how does how does OGC basically coordinate what are the documents that we need to see and approve. I mean, a lot of things, it's just a matter of approving, like a change in ownership. We don't have to sign anything unless, depending if it's affecting the use agreement. But it is a challenge, because part of it is, recap's authority only goes so far, and then it becomes either housing or a public housing issue. But when you're going back and you're touching the financing and you're affecting the use agreement, then it's recap again. So it's more, it becomes more than a development program. I don't know, John, did you want to speak at any more length about those challenges, and maybe how we should be coordinating better, at least with OGC?
Yeah, I mean, and I think I saw Kara on the call too. I mean, we are really kind of standing up all that work right now, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
what we've learned over the past 10 years and what's coming into view. I think we're working on a post-conversion notice, right, that we're looking to push through within the next year or so. Updating policies and process. So yeah, you're right though, but it does take a heck of a lot of collaboration with our PIH and multifamily program offices and you guys.
Yeah.
So that I think in the next year or two, there'll be a lot more policy and process that'll be built out on this.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it, it was kind of hit or miss, you know, like the first few that came in and some of them were very complex. Like, you know, if you were talking about the George Mason type of deals, that the university stuff, that was almost like a complete new deal, new property, new partners. Everything was different. It's almost like, wait, what did we do the first time? You know, it was so different. But, you know, I try to keep it a little more simple for our field council, but you know, the process is still the same. You know, the assignments are still the same. They come out of Bev's office, usually her, Isabella, Tamika. They come out to field council. They're giving something to look at. They're writing a short memo. They're sharing it with me. I have questions. We work it out. Everything looks good. I pass it on to recap, and sometimes with or without documents necessary. So I think, yeah, that remains a challenge and more lessons. But thank you, Kara, because I will look at that. I just came, I think, through today, and I'll get it.
And Vicki, this is Bev. I also wanted to add on to this one that I appreciate that everybody, all the OGC folks in the field are sort of rolling with it because there's an infinite number of things that can come through. We don't control that. And we also don't control how much time we have. And so it's a continuing, an ongoing challenge, even though we've certainly built out more process for it. I think that still the content is going to be continue to surprise us from time to time. And so we appreciate all working on it together, which has been the case. And, you know, we'll keep going that way.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we've developed a good partnership. And that's what keeps us strong, right, Bev? Okay. Last and finally,
Yes, we're all very nice to each other, and we all
we try to build each other up, not knock each other down, right?
exactly.
The last one is this whole fast track stuff. I'm really pleased. You know, after we got through the first few 202 rad pracs, how fast those, at least in my perception, they go a lot faster than component ones in at least what I'm seeing and what I'm handling. And unless we, you know, throw PBV in there, and then we got, you know, have some funny funding things, but I think we're doing a really good job on 202 rad pracs. So we will hope that'll continue. So that's it. Those were that's what I could think of off the top of my head, John. Is there anything else you wanted us to, we can close a little early unless there's something else you wanted to talk about, or if there's questions, like put your hands up and I'll try.
Yeah, thanks for doing this, Vicki. It's been an incredible overview on public housing and ownership control and all the lessons you've seen over the years. But it does, to add to your last point, it makes a little more sense why the 202 pracs may be a little easier on the closing side. They've, you know, only been around for maybe 15, 20 years as opposed to
Well,
something around for 70. That's a whole different ball game.
yeah, I will give housing and OGC a lot of credit for that because they're newer. We've looked, our eyes were on them more recently. And we cleared them, and that's why I think they're better. Just like the mixed finance transactions are usually, you know, cleaner. I'm always disappointed if they're not. I just, that kind of hurts me that, you know, if there were boo-boos in some of those that we're now just picking up, because, you know, I always say to my field council, you are the gold standard. you're what keeps this place running as far as, all of these requirements and getting the documents right. That's our job. We got to hold up our end of the bargain here. But yeah, I think that 202 rat prac thing is great. We just don't have as many of them to do. And, I don't know I haven't looked at the pipeline lately to see how busy it's going to be. But yeah, I think
It's
that's
gonna be busy, Vickie.
Oh, it's going to be busy.
It's gonna be busy.
Okay. Well,
Anybody,
that's good.
yeah, anybody, any questions for Vickie though? What we've talked about or anything come to mind?
Right. Well, like I said, I gave you a lot of stuff, and I mean, it's sort of soup to nuts. I mean, it was a lot of fun writing that law review article. It's been a long time since I was on law review. 40 some years ago, I was on law review, and I I was thinking, oh my gosh, can I write one of these? And I wasn't so worried about writing it. I was worried about the footnotes, because, you have this in legal writing, for something like that quality. There's this thing called the Blue Book, and there's a very detailed way to cite things. And I'm thinking, here I have two law professors looking over my back on what I turn in. One was from Yale and one was from Stetson. And I tried to be so careful with my footnotes. And the one, I made one mistake, and I made it over and over again. And that was, of course, when I was in law school, we didn't have the internet. That's how old I am. But whenever you're citing like something from a web page or something, you have to say as of a certain day, right? Because it may not be there anymore, right? It's like, even I haven't gone back to test some of my stuff, but that was the mistake I made. So I guess that was just with age, But anyway, I think most of that stuff should be there. And some of it I even pulled like from PD&R archives to get really deep into the history of public housing. And some of those, if you pull up some of those, are really cool. Some of the pictures and things, and sort of what was happening at the time. If you're like a history kind of scholar, you might enjoy that time of housing crisis. We've had so many housing crises. Let's hope we don't have another one anytime soon. But yeah, it was fun. And so I hope you'll read it. It's like I spent enough time on it, and it was like funny whenever I was asked to do it. I had to go to public affairs to get approval, right? And also to the ethics office to get approval. And they in fact, the ethics office didn't read it. They just said, anything you write, you're doing it on your own time. You're not representing the department. Okay. And public affairs then was very, careful to look and see if I had any opinions. And I expressed no opinions, just the facts, just the history, just, what HUD has said. Not my thoughts on any of it. And that's kind of hard, whenever you do have opinions on things and you really can't express them. But um, you know, it has evolved, and just like RAD is going to evolve, um, and we're maybe 50% through RAD. I don't know, that's my guess of where we are right now. That we got a lot of way to go. So I'll say goodbye to y'all, and don't be strangers. Now that you know me, um, call me. And there's a lot of names on this list I don't know, but I want to get to know you. So,
Oh, looks like we may have a question, Carolyn.
okay.
No, I was just clapping. I picked the wrong hand.
Well,
Thank you.
I appreciate the hands, Cheryl Felton. I appreciate you too. I appreciate Cheryl Felton almost every day.
Yeah, same thing.
Thank you, Vickie.
You're all terrific. All right, take care.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Vickie.
Vickie.
Thank you, Vicki.
Bye.
Thank you, Vicki. It was awesome.
Thank you.
Okay, glad